Hey guys, go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, pull up that heavy duvet, and maybe find a nice, steady rain sound to play in the background. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when Europe basically turned into one giant, miserable ice cube. It's the year 1708, heading into 1709, and the world is about to get very, very quiet. We're going to talk about the Great Frost, a winter so aggressive it made the usual European dampness look like a tropical vacation. It was a time of frozen wine, exploding trees, and monarchs realizing that all the gold in the world can't actually unfreeze your soup. So let's just relax and wander through the snowy chaos of the 18th century. It all started on the night of January 5th, 1709. Up until that point, the winter had been pretty standard. A bit of chill, some gray skies, your typical Tuesday in London or Paris. But then, a cold front moved in that was so intense it felt like the Arctic had decided to relocate to the south of France for the season. Within hours, the temperature plummeted. People woke up the next morning and realized that the world had simply stopped working. This wasn't just a wear a scarf kind of cold. This was a the birds are literally falling out of the sky mid-flight kind of cold. And of course, because this is the 1700s, everyone's first instinct was probably to blame a comet or perhaps a very specific neighbor they didn't like. Let's talk about the Sun King, Louis XIV. Now, Louis was a man who enjoyed the finer things. He liked his mirrors, his fountains, and his absolute, unquestioned authority. But even the most powerful man in Europe couldn't tell the thermometer to behave. At Versailles, the palace that was supposed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, the wine was freezing in the glasses. Imagine being a high-ranking duke, trying to look sophisticated while you're essentially licking a boozy popsicle out of a crystal goblet. Because why not have your luxury come with a side of frostbite? The king's own physicians reported that the spirits on the royal table were freezing solid. When the alcohol is turning to ice, you know the universe is officially over it. The windows at Versailles were famously drafty. Louis had built this massive, sprawling monument to his own ego, but he'd forgotten that glass is a terrible insulator. The courtiers were huddled around giant fireplaces, probably wearing every single silk robe they owned at the same time, looking less like fashion icons and more like very expensive piles of laundry. There are accounts of people's hair actually freezing to their pillows if they slept too close to a damp wall. It was a royal disaster of the most shivering variety. Louis, ever the professional, tried to keep up appearances, but it's hard to maintain an aura of divine right when your nose is purple and you haven't felt your toes since Epiphany. Moving away from the shivering French elite, the rest of Europe wasn't doing much better. In England, the River Thames froze so solid that they did what British people always do when faced with a crisis: they set up a market on it. These were the famous frost fairs. They'd drag entire pubs onto the ice, roast oxen, and play games, which seems like a lot of effort when you could just stay inside by a fire. But I suppose when the world is ending, you might as well get a pint on a frozen river. It was all fun and games until the ice started to groan, reminding everyone that they were standing over several meters of liquid death. The sheer logistics of the cold were absurd. In the countryside, the sap inside the trees began to freeze, and because water expands when it turns to ice, the trees started to literally explode. People reported hearing loud cracks echoing through the forests, sounding like musket fire. It was nature's way of saying, "I'm stressed," and honestly, same. Imagine walking through a quiet, snowy woods only for an oak tree to spontaneously detonate next to you. It really adds a certain spice to a morning stroll. Then we have the animals. This is where it gets a bit sad, but in that distant, historical way that allows us to stay sleepy. The livestock didn't stand a chance. Sheep were found frozen in huddles, and even wolves were getting desperate. There are stories of wolves wandering into the streets of major cities looking for anything that wasn't a frozen rock to eat. In the stables of the wealthy, horses were found frozen standing up. It was a literal standstill. Even the birds, as I mentioned, were just dropping. It's said that if you were walking down a path, you'd just see dozens of tiny frozen sparrows littering the ground like gray pebbles. Let's float over to the Great Northern War, because of course, humans were still trying to kill each other despite the weather. Charles XII of Sweden, who was basically a professional soldier disguised as a king, was trying to invade Russia. Now, invading Russia in the winter is famously a one-star review kind of idea, but Charles was convinced he was built differently. His soldiers, however, were not. During the winter of 1709, the Swedish army was decimated not by bullets, but by the air itself. Soldiers would sit down to rest for 5 minutes and simply never get up. It's estimated that Charles lost about 2,000 men in a single night just to the cold. At one point, the Swedish troops were so desperate for warmth that they were reportedly cutting open their horses and crawling inside them for heat. It's very The Empire Strikes Back, but with more lace and 18th century muskets. Charles himself, who was notoriously stubborn, probably just adjusted his hat and told everyone to keep marching, because why admit defeat to a thermometer? Back in the cities, the food situation was becoming, well, grim. Since the ground was frozen several feet deep, no one could plant anything. The winter wheat, the stuff that was supposed to keep everyone alive through the spring, was completely destroyed. This led to the Great Famine. In France alone, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people died. But the way the aristocracy handled it was peak 1709. They basically just suggested that people eat less or perhaps find some roots. Louis XIV did eventually melt down some of his silver furniture to help pay for grain, which is a nice gesture, I guess, but it's a bit like giving a Band-Aid to someone who has been hit by a glacier. The cold lasted for 3 solid months. It wasn't until April that the ice finally started to break up. And when it did, it brought a whole new set of problems: flooding. Because, of course, all that frozen water had to go somewhere. Bridges were swept away by massive chunks of ice that acted like slow-moving battering rams. It was the winter that just kept giving. Throughout all of this, the scientists of the day, who were really just guys with a lot of free time and some glass tubes, were trying to figure out what was happening. They didn't have the term Little Ice Age yet, but they knew this wasn't normal. They recorded temperatures that we still use today to understand historical climate shifts. It was a pivot point in history where the environment reminded humanity that despite our fancy palaces and our gunpowder, we are very much at the mercy of a few degrees difference. So, as you're tucked in and feeling the warmth of your room, just imagine being in Versailles in 1709. You're wearing a powdered wig that's probably collecting frost. Your wine is a solid brick of purple ice, and you can hear the trees in the garden exploding like fireworks. It's quiet, it's white, and it's impossibly, ridiculously cold. But for us, it's just a story. A long, cold, drifting story to help the mind settle. The great frost eventually thawed. The Sun King eventually got his warm soup back, and Europe eventually dried out. And as the world moved on, the memory of that winter stayed, a shivering ghost in the history books. The Sun King's frozen ego and the royal meltdown. So we're still in the grip of 1709, and while the peasants were outside dealing with exploding oak trees, things inside the Palace of Versailles were a different kind of disaster. You see, Louis XIV, the Sun King, had spent his entire life crafting an image of himself as a semi-divine being who sat at the center of the universe. He was the man who said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state, which is the ultimate main character energy move. But the Great Frost didn't care about his divine right. It treated the King of France like any other biological organism that wasn't designed to live in a walk-in freezer. The atmosphere at Versailles during these months was, to put it mildly, deeply awkward. Imagine the most expensive, gilded, and mirrored building in the world, but everyone inside is wearing 5 layers of fur, and their breath is visible in the throne room.
Louis was getting older. He was 70 in 1709, and his health was already a bit of a chaotic mess. He had survived gout, various royal infections, and a truly horrifying anal surgery a few years prior that became a matter of national concern. But this cold was a different beast. It got into his bones. Of course, he insisted on maintaining the royal routine, because if the king doesn't eat his multi-course dinner in front of a crowd of staring nobles, does the sun even rise? The dinner table was the site of the most famous tragedy of the Frost, the frozen wine. It's one of those historical details that sounds like a joke, but for the French elite, it was a legitimate crisis. The wine was kept in the cellars, which you'd think would stay warm, but the frost was so deep it bypassed the stone foundations. When the servants brought the carafes up to the royal table, the liquid turned into a slushy right before the king's eyes. They had to put the wine bottles by the fireplace to thaw them out, which, as any wine snob will tell you, is a great way to turn a vintage Bordeaux into something that tastes like wet cardboard. But Louis drank it anyway, probably with a look of extreme, silent judgment. Let's float over to the king's physical state for a moment, because his medical history is a saga of its own. By 1709, Louis was essentially a walking pharmacy. His doctors, led by a man named Guy Crescent Fagan, believed that the secret to health was constant purging. They gave him laxatives and emetics with a frequency that would make a modern doctor faint. So picture this. The king is freezing cold, the palace is drafty, the wine is frozen, and he is also dealing with the cleansing effects of 18th century medicine. It wasn't exactly a dignified time for the monarchy. Fagan, who was a frail, hunchbacked man himself, would scuttle around the king, wrapping him in more blankets and insisting that the cold was just a test of his humors, because why admit you have no control over the weather when you can blame it on an imbalance of black bile? The courtiers were having an even worse time. To live at Versailles was a privilege, but during the Great Frost it was a gilded cage made of ice. The palace had over 2,000 windows, and in 1709 they were mostly single-pane glass that leaked air like a sieve. The massive fireplaces, while impressive to look at, did almost nothing to heat the cavernous rooms with 20-foot ceilings. People were literally sleeping in their clothes. The Duchess of Orleans wrote in her letters that the cold was so unbearable that she couldn't sit at her desk to write for more than 5 minutes before her ink froze in the well. She described seeing the water in her wash basin turn into a solid block of ice right next to her bed. It's hard to maintain the glamour of the Baroque era when you can't even wash your face with a hammer. Meanwhile, the king's personal life was becoming increasingly somber. He had outlived many of his children and grandchildren, and the War of Spanish Succession, was draining the country dry. The frost felt like a divine punishment. Louis, who had spent his youth being the handsome king, was now a stooped old man watching his people starve. He actually sold the royal gold plate, the plates he ate off of, to pay for the war and bread for the poor. It was a rare moment of relative humility, though he still had plenty of silver left over, so let's not get too misty-eyed for him. The ironic contrast here is just so 1700s. You have the most absolute monarch in history, a man who built a palace so grand it defined an age, sitting in a dark room, huddled under furs, eating off a simple ceramic plate because he had to melt down his gold ones. It was a visual metaphor for the end of an era. The sun was being extinguished by a very literal, very physical winter. And then there was the smell. We don't often talk about the smell of history, but Versailles was notorious for it even in good weather. With the frost, the pipes, as they were, froze and burst. The elaborate fountains in the gardens, the pride of Louis's heart, were silenced. The Dragon Fountain and the Latona Fountain were just giant, jagged sculptures of ice. Without the flowing water to carry away the waste, the palace became a sensory nightmare. It was a cold, stagnant, and very perfumed hell. As the winter dragged into February, the social fabric began to fray. The gentle humor of the court turned into dark sarcasm. People joked that the only thing that hadn't frozen was the king's taxes. There were bread riots in Paris, and the king's own carriages were sometimes booed when they passed through the streets. For a man who lived for the adoration of his subjects, this was a chill deeper than the frost. He began to withdraw, spending more time with his secret wife, Madame de Maintenon. She was a deeply religious, somewhat stern woman who encouraged Louis to see the frost as a call to repentance. So while the world outside was dying of cold, the king was inside, being lectured on his sins while his toes turned blue. Let's just drift for a moment on that image. The King of France, the man who shaped Europe, sitting in a dim, freezing room, listening to a woman tell him why his soul was as chilly as the weather. It's a very quiet, very still kind of tragedy. No battles, no shouting, just the sound of the wind whistling through the hall of mirrors and the occasional crack of a frozen tree exploding in the distance. By the time the thaw finally arrived in late March, the damage was done. The Sun King survived the frost, but the myth of his invincibility was gone. He had been humbled by a thermometer. The gardens were a graveyard of dead orange trees. Louis loved his orange trees, and he had spent a fortune keeping them in orangeries, but the 1709 frost was so deep it killed almost all of them. It was a personal blow to him. A symbol of his power didn't extend to the natural world. So as we settle into the night, we leave Louis XIV there, shivering in his silk robes, looking out at a frozen garden, waiting for a spring that felt like it would never come. The Great Frost was a reminder that even the most dysfunctional, inbred, and powerful royals are still just people who need a good heater.
The frozen Thames and the carnival of chaos. So, while the French royals were busy shivering in their gilded icebox at Versailles, let's float across the English Channel to London. If the French responded to the Great Frost of 1709 with a mix of prayers and frozen wine, the British responded with their favorite coping mechanism, turning a disaster into an outdoor pub crawl. Because, of course, if the world is ending and the river has turned into a solid highway of ice, why not set up a grill and sell some questionable sausages on it? The River Thames was the lifeblood of London, usually teeming with boats, coal barges, and the occasional floating bit of refuse. But by early January 1709, the river had stopped moving entirely. The ice didn't just form a thin crust, it froze feet thick, all the way down past the London Bridge. Now, for most people, a frozen river is a logistical nightmare. For Londoners, it was an invitation. This was the era of the frost fairs, and the 1709 fair was a legendary spectacle of the weird, the cold, and the slightly absurd. Imagine walking down to the riverbank. Instead of the gray, swirling water, you see a vast white expanse stretching from bank to bank. And on that ice, people had built an entire city of tents. They called it Friesland Street or Blanket Fair. There were rows of stalls selling everything from hot gin and gingerbread to handmade trinkets. They even dragged printing presses onto the ice. For a few pence, you could have your name printed on a souvenir card that stated you had stood upon the frozen Thames in the year of our Lord 1709. It was the 18th century version of a checked-in status on social media, because if you didn't have a piece of paper proving you survived the ice, did it even happen? The atmosphere was a strange blend of a holiday and a funeral. On one hand, people were literally starving in the streets of London because the price of coal had tripled and the bread was too expensive to buy. On the other hand, you had the wealthy and the desperate alike sliding around on the ice, watching bear baiting matches and playing games of ninepins. There's a certain dry irony in the fact that while people were burning their furniture just to stay alive in their drafty apartments, others were out on the river roasting an entire ox over a massive bonfire. Yes, they build bonfires on the ice, because why not double down on the danger?
The ox roasting was the centerpiece of the fair. They would dig a shallow pit into the ice, line it with iron plates, and light a fire hot enough to cook a whole cow. It's a miracle the entire population of London didn't end up in the freezing depths of the river, but the ice held. It was so thick that even heavy horse-drawn carriages were being driven across it as if it were a paved road. It became a shortcut for the city, a temporary bridge that didn't charge a toll, which probably annoyed the local authorities to no end. But let's talk about the smells and sounds of this frozen carnival. It wasn't a winter wonderland from a Hallmark movie. It was loud, crowded, and smelled like a mix of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the pervasive scent of thousands of unwashed bodies huddled together for warmth. The sleepless historian vibe here is one of damp wool and shivering excitement. You'd hear the constant thwack of skates, which back then were often just sharpened animal bones tied to shoes, and the low, ominous groaning of the ice as the tides shifted underneath. It was a sound that reminded everyone that their party was happening on a very thin, very temporary floor. Of course, the humor of the time was just as cold as the weather. Sarcastic broadsides were published, mocking the Great Frost and the politicians who couldn't fix it. One popular joke was that the ice was the only thing in London that wasn't being taxed by the Queen. Queen Anne, by the way, was not out on the ice. She was likely ensconced in St. James's Palace, dealing with her own litany of health issues, mostly gout and the tragic aftermath of 17 failed pregnancies. While her subjects were sliding around on the Thames, she was navigating the icy politics of her own court, which was just as treacherous as the river. The 1709 Frost Fair was also a place for the weird. There were reports of ice beauties, women dressed in their finest silks, braving the frost to show off their fashion, only to have their makeup literally crack and peel off in the wind. There were shops that sold frozen curiosities, which were mostly just normal items that had been left outside, but people bought them anyway because the novelty of the cold had made everyone a little bit mad. But as we drift further into the night of 1709, we have to remember the dark side of this party. The Great Frost was a killer. Every night, the bill of mortality in London grew longer. People were found frozen in doorways, huddled under thin blankets. The casual and conversational tone of the time often masked a deep underlying terror. The ice wasn't just a playground, it was a prison. No ships could get in or out of the harbor. This meant no coal from Newcastle, no grain from the countryside, and no news from the war in Europe. London was an island of ice, cut off from the rest of the world. Let's float over to a specific character on the ice, a nameless street vendor. He's selling saloop, a hot drink made from ground orchid roots and sweetened with sugar. It was the 1700s version of a latte, and during the frost, it was basically liquid gold. He's standing there, his fingers probably black with frostbite, serving a duke who has ventured out from his mansion to see what the fuss is about. The duke is wearing a mountain of ermine fur, looking like a very fancy, very annoyed bear. They share a moment of mutual misery, two people from opposite ends of the social spectrum, both united by the fact that their breath is turning into crystals before it even leaves their mouths. As February rolled around, the fun of the Frost Fair began to wear thin. The ice started to get rotten, a term the locals used for ice that was melting from the bottom up. The tents were packed away, the printing presses were hauled back to solid ground, and the roasted ox bones were tossed into the slush. When the thaw finally came, it was violent. The ice broke apart in massive chunks, crashing against the pilings of London Bridge with the sound of cannon fire. The river reclaimed its territory, washing away the temporary city of Friesland Street as if it had never existed. So as you settle deeper into your pillows, think of that transition, the transition from the silent, frozen carnival to the rushing, muddy chaos of the spring thaw. The Great Frost of 1709 left behind a continent that was scarred, hungry, and exhausted. but it also left behind these strange, quiet stories of human resilience, or perhaps just human stubbornness. We look back at them now and see a world that was so much more fragile than ours, yet somehow managed to throw a party on the very thing that was trying to kill them. The Thames eventually flowed again, the frost fairs became a memory of the past, and the people of London went back to their usual business of being damp and grumpy in the rain. But for those few months, the river was a stage for the weirdest show on earth.
The thaw, the hunger, and the reshaping of empires. All right, take a deep breath and settle back in. The ice is starting to groan, but we aren't out of the woods yet. If parts 1 through 3 were about the shock of the freeze, part 4 is about the slow, agonizing realization that a frozen world has very real, very permanent consequences. When the sun finally started to gain a little bit of strength in the spring of 1709, it didn't bring immediate relief. Instead, it revealed a continent that had been effectively broken. This is the part of the story where the Great Frost stops being a quirky historical anecdote about frozen wine and starts being a geopolitical sledgehammer. Let's float back to the fields of Europe. You see, the problem with a frost this deep, reaching down several feet into the soil, is that it doesn't just kill the plants, it kills the future. The winter wheat, which had been planted in the autumn of 1708, was the backbone of the European diet. It was supposed to stay dormant under a nice insulating blanket of snow, but in 1709, the snow didn't come everywhere, or it came too late. The bare ground was exposed to temperatures that were frankly insulting. The wheat didn't just die, it rotted in the ground as it thawed. By April, farmers across France, Germany, and Italy were looking at black, muddy fields where there should have been green shoots. And this is where the casual snark of history turns a bit dark. The French government, under our old friend Louis XIV, realized they were facing a famine of biblical proportions. But because they were embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession, they couldn't just stop and help everyone. They needed soldiers, and soldiers need bread. So the government did what governments do best. They started seizing grain. Imagine being a peasant who has survived the coldest winter in human memory, only to have a soldier in a fancy hat show up and take your last bag of flour because the king needs to keep fighting a war over who gets to sit on a throne in Madrid, because obviously royal genealogy is much more important than your family not starving to death. This led to the bread riots. In Paris, women marched on Versailles, a precursor to the much more famous march that would happen decades later during the French Revolution. They weren't looking for democracy, they were looking for a loaf of bread that didn't cost a month's wages. Louis XIV, safe behind his walls, but feeling the heat of the public's anger, actually sent his own gold dinner service to the mint to be melted down. It was a grand gesture, but you can't exactly eat gold coins, and the grain simply wasn't there to buy. The price of wheat jumped by over 600% in some areas. It was a total economic collapse, frozen into place by a single bad winter. But let's shift our gaze eastward toward the snowy plains of Russia and Ukraine, because the Great Frost didn't just change the price of bread, it changed the map of the world. Remember Charles XII of Sweden, the guy who thought he could outmarch the Russian winter? Well, by the spring of 1709, his grand army was anything but grand. They were a collection of shivering, frost-bitten men wandering through a wasteland. Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, was playing a very patient game. He knew that the cold was his best general. He just stayed back, let his scorched earth policy do the work, and waited for the Swedes to turn into popsicles. In June 1709, we reached the Battle of Poltava. Now, in any other year, the Swedish army, famed as the best in Europe, might have crushed the Russians, but Charles's men were exhausted.
Their gunpowder was damp from the melting snow, their fingers were missing digits from frostbite, and their king was literally being carried on a litter because he'd been shot in the foot and it wouldn't heal in the cold. It was a disaster. The Swedish Empire, which had dominated Northern Europe for a century, effectively ended that day. Russia emerged as the new great power of the East, all because a cold front in January had done more damage than any cannon ever could. It's funny in a grim sort of way how a few degrees of temperature can determine which language people will be speaking in Eastern Europe for the next 300 years. Back in the Mediterranean, the frost had done the unthinkable. It had frozen the lagoons of Venice. Imagine the most romantic, watery city in the world, but instead of gondolas gliding through green canals, you have people walking across the ice to get to the grocery store. The olive trees in Italy and the orange groves in Spain, plants that hadn't seen a real freeze in generations, were wiped out. This wasn't just a loss of one harvest, it took decades for those trees to regrow. The economic heart of South Europe was effectively cut out. The sunny South became a land of gray, dead wood and silent orchards. And what about the intellectuals of the day? The Enlightenment was just starting to flicker into life. Scientists like William Durham in England were busy writing down every detail of the frost. They were obsessed with the extraordinary cold. They started to realize that the climate wasn't a fixed, God-given constant, but something that could shift and bite back. It was a humbling moment for the age of reason. Humans were discovering that they could categorize every plant and chart every star, but they still couldn't stop a January breeze from killing half the sheep in Scotland. As we move through the aftermath, the Great Frost of 1709 becomes a ghost that haunts the rest of the century. It led to changes in farming, with people turning more toward the potato, a sturdy underground tuber that didn't care much about a bit of frost. It led to better building techniques, as the wealthy realized that drafty palaces were essentially beautiful tombs, and it left a scar on the collective memory of Europe. For 100 years afterward, grandfathers would sit by the fire and tell their grandkids about the winter when the birds froze in the air and the king ate off a clay plate. Let's just float for a second on that idea of the potato. Because of one really cold winter, the entire diet of Northern Europe shifted. The humble spud became the hero of the working class because it was reliable. It's those little ironic twists that make history so cozy to think about. A geopolitical catastrophe, a royal meltdown, and the fall of the Swedish Empire, all resulting in more mashed potatoes for everyone. So, as the world of 1709 finally warmed up, it wasn't the same world that had gone to sleep in December 1708. The Sun King was older and sadder, the British had a new appreciation for the stability of their river, and the Russians were suddenly the most powerful people in the room. The ice had melted, but the landscape it left behind was unrecognizable. Go ahead and adjust your pillow now. The shivering is over. The great thaw has come and gone, and the 18th century is moving on towards its next series of beautifully dysfunctional events. We've survived the Great Frost together, drifting through the cold halls of Versailles and across the crowded ice of the Thames. The world is warm again, the story is settling into the floorboards, and the silence of the snow is just a lingering thought.
The ghost of the Habsburgs and the War of the Spanish Succession. Now that we've finally let the ice of 1709 melt away, let's float down south toward Spain. While the rest of Europe was busy shivering and roasting oxen on the Thames, the Spanish Empire was essentially having a decade-long emotional and political meltdown. You see, the Great Frost didn't just happen in a vacuum. It arrived right in the middle of the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that was basically the world's most expensive and violent family feud. And at the heart of this feud was a man who was, quite frankly, a biological miracle, but not in the way you'd want.
We're talking about Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. To understand why Europe was tearing itself apart while the thermometers were bottoming out, we have to look at the genetic train wreck that led to this point. The Habsburgs were a family that took the idea of keeping it in the family to a terrifying extreme. They were so worried about their royal blood being diluted by commoners, which to them meant anyone who wasn't their first cousin, that they essentially turned their family tree into a wreath. By the time Charles II was born, his ancestors had spent generations marrying their nieces and cousins, because why look for a spouse across the border when you can just look across the dinner table? Charles II was the result of this strategy, and he was, to put it gently, a bit of a disaster. He was called the Bewitched, but the highly inbred would have been more scientifically accurate. He had the famous Habsburg jaw, a chin so prominent and a lower lip so thick that he couldn't actually chew his food properly. He literally swallowed his meals whole, which probably didn't help his already precarious digestion. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his tongue was so large that his speech was almost unintelligible. He was the ruler of a global empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru, yet he was a man who struggled to not trip over his own feet. Of course, because the Spanish court was obsessed with etiquette and tradition, they treated Charles like a living god. They dressed him in heavy, stiff brocades and surrounded him with dwarves and jesters, trying to maintain a facade of majesty. But behind the curtains, it was a tragedy. Charles was sickly, plagued by migraines, and frequently convinced he was being haunted by demons. His doctors, who were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, tried to cure him by placing the warm entrails of freshly pilled pigeons on his stomach, because when you have a genetic disorder caused by centuries of inbreeding, obviously the solution is bird guts. When Charles finally shuffled off this mortal coil in 1700, he left no heirs. He couldn't. His body was simply done. His autopsy is one of the most famous and grim documents in history, stating that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. He was essentially a person held together by sheer willpower and royal starch. And since he had no children, the question of who would get his massive empire became the spark that set Europe on fire. This brings us back to our friend Louis XIV of France and the frosty mess of 1709. Louis wanted his grandson Philip to take the Spanish throne. The Holy Roman Emperor, a Habsburg from the Austrian branch, naturally thought it should stay in the family. So they did the only logical thing. They spent 14 years killing each other over it. By the time the Great Frost hit, the war had been dragging on for 8 years. Spain was the prize, but the Spanish people were caught in the middle of a tug-of-war between a French prince and an Austrian archduke. Let's float over to Madrid during the Great Frost. While the French were freezing at Versailles, the Spanish were experiencing a winter that felt like the end of the world. Spain is a land of sun and olive oil, but in 1709 the high plateau of Castile turned into a tundra. The palace in Madrid, the Alcazar, was a drafty, gloomy fortress. Philip V, the new French-born king, was trying to settle in, but he found himself leading a country that was broke, hungry, and now literally frozen. Philip V himself was an interesting character. He suffered from what they called melancholy, which we would today recognize as severe clinical depression. There were times when he refused to get out of bed for months or refused to cut his toenails because he thought his feet were made of glass. Imagine being a soldier in the trenches of the Spanish succession, shivering in the 1709 frost, knowing that your king is currently hiding under his blankets because he's afraid he might shatter. It's a very sleepless historian kind of irony, the fate of millions resting on the shoulders of a man who was terrified of his own feet. Of course, the contrast between the two sides was almost comical. On one side, you had the French influence, heavy, baroque, and obsessed with centralizing power. On the other, the traditional Spanish nobility, who still dressed in the black, high-collared outfits of the 16th century and spent their time arguing about who got to hold the king's napkin. They were fighting over an empire that was slowly slipping away, while the very ground they stood on was cracking from the cold. The 1909 frost actually helped bring the war to a stalemate. It was simply too cold to fight. The armies retreated to their winter quarters, which were usually just damp huts or ruined villages. The hunger we talked about in Part 4 hit the soldiers the hardest. In Spain, the supply lines collapsed. The mules that carried the grain died in the mountain passes, their frozen carcasses lining the roads like morbid milestones. Because why not add a famine to a civil war? It's the classic historical double whammy. The Spanish people, who had endured centuries of rigid religious orthodoxy and imperial decline, found themselves eating grass and bark. There's a certain dry, tragic humor in the fact that the two most powerful dynasties in Europe, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, were so focused on their right to rule that they almost forgot they needed a living population to rule over. As we drift toward the end of this part, imagine the scene in a small Spanish village in February 1709. The bell churches are silent because the bell ringer's hands are too cold to pull the ropes. A portrait of the late jaw-heavy Charles II still hangs on a wall, looking out with vacant eyes at a room full of people huddling around a tiny fire. They don't care about Philip V or Archduke Charles. They just want the sky to stop being gray and the bread to stop being made of sawdust. The war would eventually end with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Philip V got to keep the throne, but he had to give up almost everything else: the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily. Spain was no longer the superpower of the world. It was a tired, shrunken version of itself. The Great Frost had acted like a cold compress on the fever of the war, leaving the ambitions of the Sun King and the Habsburg dream of a united Europe in tatters. So, as you tuck your chin into your blanket, think of the Habsburg jaw. Think of the poor, bewitched Charles II and the cold, melancholic Philip V. They were men trapped by their bloodlines and their titles, shivering just like everyone else when the world turned to ice.